In 1919, under the gray sky of post-revolutionary Russia, a 20-year-old girl found herself facing a crossroads of life and death. Catherine de Hueck, known only by her aristocratic title of Baroness, lived in times of deep despondency. The streets of his hometown were marked by the echoes of a revolution that promised equality but brought with it violence and persecution, especially for those of his class. The Baroness was a figure of undisputed beauty, with clear, piercing eyes that reflected in them her equally lucid mind. Her upbringing had been singular, appropriate for a young woman of her position, but the revolution had completely shattered the foundations of her world. Catherine not only feared for her life, but also worried about her son's future. Her husband, a man of equal nobility, had sought refuge in Canada before the borders were closed, leaving her behind in the effervescent revolutionary upheaval. Amid the chaos, Catherine made the difficult but wise decision to leave her homeland. With limited resources and failing health, she embarked on an uncertain journey to London. The English capital, with its streets and parks that she had hitherto only known from books and stories, became her brief abode. There, the Baroness faced the harsh reality of a helpless immigrant. Loneliness was her constant companion, and concern for her son's well-being consumed her. These were hard times. The Baroness, accustomed to a life of comfort, had grown up far from privation, had had a bonanza childhood growing up on one of the huge farms of her father, Dmitry Fyodorovich, accustomed to the regalia and stewardship of her servants. The whole revolution and now the weeks in London made her soft spirit soon stiffen in the face of so much. Encouraged by a distant uncle who spoke of the wonders of New York, where, according to him, dollars fell from trees, Catherine decided to leave Europe. With what little he had left, he bought a ticket to the United States on one of the first intercontinental flights in history, feeding only on hopes as fragile as the faded notes in his purse. Upon arriving in New York, Katerina faced the harsh reality of a city that does not sleep but also does not forgive. She found work in a laundry room, a humid and suffocating environment where the steam from the machines fogged not only the windows, but also the dreams of its workers. On a salary of $8 a week, she could barely support herself, but still, she sent $2 to her husband and son in Canada. Life in New York was a daily challenge. Catherine tried to use her skill with words to write for local newspapers, narrating the horrors and hopes of her homeland, but her manuscripts returned with the same coldness of unsolicited letters. Desperate, she sought help from a charity, but instead of support she found contempt. The doors that slammed in his face and the harsh words he heard echoed long in his mind on bitter afternoons as he walked desolately along the banks of the Hudson River. In those cold, dark days, the dark water seemed inviting, an outlet for the pain that consumed his heart. Lost in dark thoughts, Catherine de Hueck stared out at the turbulent waters of the Hudson River, pondering the weight of her loneliness and despair. The biting cold of the icy wind seemed to freeze not only his body, but also his soul. He brought his arm forward, trying to stop the icy wind from cutting his cheekbones, but he could not resist. The tears of despair came to the fore, and it was just as the tears began to blur his vision, an unexpected voice cut through the silence. "Hey, Blondie, what are you doing there?" He was a taxi driver, a middle-aged man with gentle features and a Brooklyn accent he couldn't hide. He had parked his yellow cab a little distance away and approached her with a worried look. Catherine turned, surprised and somewhat suspicious. "I have nowhere to go, no money to pay for the taxi," she replied in a trembling voice, hugging herself to try to warm her body. The man did not retreat. On the contrary, he took a step towards her, with an even more intense look. "Tell the truth," he continued. "You were thinking of jumping into the water, weren't you?" I could tell by his face of hunger and despair. Although initially fearful, there was something about the man's sincerity that caused Catherine to let her guard down. He introduced himself as George, a family man and practicing religionist. "Come on, I'll take you to eat something. Burgers, it'll be on me," he offered with an encouraging smile. After hesitating for a brief moment, hunger and weariness overcame fear and distrust. She accepted the invitation, and together they got into the taxi. While George drove in silence to a nearby diner, Catherine, still suspicious, also remained silent, looking out the window of the car that cut the wide streets of New York, thinking about how it was that situation had come. During the meal, already with a full stomach, George finally said something, asking, "What happened to you?" At that moment, the Baroness finally managed to look into the eyes of the Lord who had helped her, and filling her lungs, she let off steam. George listened intently as Catherine recounted her journey, from the horrors of the revolution in her homeland to the hardships she faced in New York. In the twilight of the Russian Empire, before the dawn of the Communist Revolution of 1917, only 18-year-old Catherine de Hueck lived amid the luxury and tradition of the Russian aristocracy. Heiress of vast lands and influential lineage, her life was filled with balls, operas and winters in palaces heated by immense marble fireplaces. Catherine was educated by the best tutors and frequented the most exclusive social circles of the nobility of St. Petersburg. But not only that, Catherine kept under her vast power hundreds of well-paid employees, besides being at that time one of the largest philanthropists in the entire Russian territory, maintaining 5 large orphanages scattered throughout the territory. However, the winds of change were beginning to blow strongly over Russia. Social inequality and popular dissatisfaction, fueled by poverty and war, were brewing in the streets. While Catherine reveled in waltzes, the masses began to gather in whispers of revolution that began in distant, unheated taverns. What seemed to be only distant murmurs would soon turn into a deafening roar that could no longer be ignored. The revolution broke out with violence that split the nation. The Tsarist regime, under which Catherine's family had flourished, collapsed like a house of cards. Armed demonstrators marched through the streets, and the palaces that once symbolized imperial greatness now burned in flames of rebellion. Catherine's own life was in danger. Her family was forced to flee their ancestral home under the cover of night, leaving behind all their possessions and also their history. With the fall of the empire, the new communist order began to chop up the estates of the nobles. Everything that Catherine's family owned was confiscated or destroyed. The lands that had sustained generations now fed the new regime, and memories of a glorious past were trampled under the march of the revolution. Destitute and homeless, Catherine and her family became refugees in their own country. For months, they wandered from city to city, hiding and surviving as they could. The cold was relentless, and hunger a constant ghost in their journeys. Catherine, once nurtured with pampering and affection, now faced the harsh reality of a world that had no mercy on the fallen nobility. She saw, with disbelieving eyes, hungry children and old men abandoned in the streets, a distorted reflection of what her life had been. And what bothered him most was precisely the revolution they said it was for the people, now crushing the people themselves against the soil of the nation. While in the possessions taken, petty new burghers reveled in what they had taken. It was with a heavy heart that her husband, Ivan, fearing that the situation would tighten, proposed that they flee from there. Catherine denied, saying that they wait a little longer. But in the face of this impasse, Ivan took the couple's son, Fyodor, only 2 years old, and managed to escape, leaving behind Catherine, who decided to stay, not out of courage, but because she wanted to help those who were thrown in the street. But as feared by Ivan, eventually the situation became untenable. The news of executions and arrests of former nobles grew every day, and the danger of staying was greater than that of fleeing. It was then that Catherine finally decided to leave her native country, realizing that if she died, she could do nothing more. With forged documents and what little money they could scrape together, she and some family members who had stayed behind embarked on a perilous journey across Russia's borders toward England. The journey was marked by fear and uncertainty. Catherine, dressed no longer in silks but in rags, learned the true meaning of resilience. She crossed borders hiding in train cars and survived days in makeshift shelters. Every step taken away from Russia was a step towards the unknown, but necessary for security. Finally, after months of wandering, Catherine arrived in London. Exhausted but safe, she set foot on foreign soil with nothing but her name and the scars of a life shattered by the revolution. London would only be a temporary stop in his quest for safety. North America, with its promises of freedom and opportunity, called to her, where she hoped to rebuild her life from the ashes of her aristocratic past. Touched by the story of the young Baroness, George invited her to spend a few days at his home, where she could rest and recuperate. In the humble but cozy home of George and his family, Catherine found a temporary refuge. His wife, a kind and understanding woman named Mary, welcomed him as if he were a daughter. After 2 days in the care of George's family, Catherine felt empowered to resume her fight for survival. Before leaving, George, noticing the renewed determination in the young woman's gaze, offered her enough money to pay for a few weeks in a modest pension. Grateful and moved, Catherine accepted the money, promising to repay as soon as she could. On the frosty morning she left George's house, she walked the streets of New York, muttering a silent prayer. "My God, forgive me that thought of despair by the river. Help me get a job." It was then that a strong wind blew, throwing in his face a piece of dirty paper. Unfolding it, Catherine discovered that it was a sheet of newspaper advertisements, with a section that called for maids. A smile touched her lips as she looked up at the gray sky, realizing the divine irony at that moment. God is very strange indeed, she thought, with a mixture of relief and wonder. He sends taxi drivers after a desperate young woman, speaks in the voice of the winds, and even answers for the newspaper. Inspired by this sign, Catherine headed towards the address indicated in the advertisement, feeling guided by a force greater than any adversity she had ever faced. With a heart full of hope, Catherine followed the address indicated in the newspaper, an elegant neighborhood on the outskirts of Manhattan. Fate brought her to the house of a wealthy family in search of a maid who could not only take care of cleaning, but also have refined knowledge to interact with frequent guests. It was the perfect opportunity for Catherine, who with her education and class could fit well into this environment. She was greeted by a gentle matriarch, Mrs. Eleanor, who was impressed not only by Catherine's poise, but also by her ability to express herself in English so eloquently. During the interview, Catherine quietly shared part of her story and her difficulties, which evoked an immediate empathy for Mrs. Eleanor. She was hired on the spot, with the promise of a decent salary and housing, a blessing she didn't expect so soon. Working in the Winstons' home proved to be a transformative experience. She was treated with respect and dignity, something she had not felt for a long time. Over time, he gained the trust of the family, and his responsibilities gradually increased, including accompanying the couple's children to social events. Those events were difficult, not because he had to deal with the upper bourgeois class, now in the role of a servant, but because he accompanied the couple's children, thus remembering his little Fyodor, who grew up far from his arms, with his father in Canada, and there the situation was not as favorable as that of Catherine, so he tried hard, dreaming that soon they would be able to raise the amount so that Ivan and Fyodor would come to live in New York. And because of this, it is that at these events, taking advantage of every opportunity, Catherine began to narrate with extreme vividness her experiences in revolutionary Russia, capturing the attention of many with her vivid and exciting accounts. These stories didn't just intrigue the guests, they touched their hearts. It was at an unpretentious dinner that luck, or God, struck him again. That day, exhausted by crying all night, after Ivan's last correspondence, who had reported that his son had been affected by a fever that did not return. Because of this, Ivan could no longer work. What was already difficult became unsustainable. At dinner, even disconsolate by the latest events, Catherine continued to keep her faith, praying quietly and smiling throughout, until a man, Rodolphe, approached her, intrigued by what he had heard of that young girl. Catherine smiled at him, and although she was dusty inside, she still narrated in rich detail all the horror she had gone through. Rudolph smiled and thanked him for the report, saying goodbye without saying who it was. That night, Catherine slept in distress, and all was made worse when the next morning Rudolph returned to the Winston mansion. Fearing that he might be linked to someone in the revolution, she felt feverish and wanted to get around the idea of seeing him, but there was no way. Catherine went to meet him, and Rudolph smiled when he saw him. He was a famous editor of a renowned publishing house, who approached that morning with a proposal already in hand: write a book about his experiences. With the help and encouragement of the Winston family, she accepted the offer, and that same week began writing her autobiography. That same day, he sent a telegram urgently to Ivan, said that they should come in any way they could to New York, because now the situation would change. The publication of the book Voices of Silence, My Life in the Russian Revolution, was a resounding success. Catherine was catapulted to fame almost overnight. The audience was fascinated by the combination of his aristocracy, the brutality of his story, and the grace with which he overcame adversity. Soon, she was traveling the United States, lecturing and speaking at events, where she shared not only her story, but also messages of faith, hope, and the importance of human resilience. With the money she earned from book sales and conferences, Catherine began to realize an old dream: to help others in desperate situations. Inspired by the help she had received from George and his family, she founded Friendship Houses in 1930, safe places where people in need could find food, shelter, and, most importantly, a community that welcomed them. Years later, Catherine expanded her vision and founded Madonna House on a donated island in Canada. This refuge became a center of international charity, helping thousands of people, from the homeless and hungry to those just looking for meaning in their lives. Catherine lived prosperously, serving others until the end of her life. She and Ivan had 4 more children in America.